I've gotten so many questions about how I built Hogger's head, so in this video I'll show you everything that went into it, from the tips of his ears to the point of his nose. Hello, I'm Kazul, and welcome to my lair. Now, this is Hogger's head, and by far it is one of the pieces that I get the most questions about. And it's probably one of the pieces that has the most detail packed into such a small area. Now, I'm going to go through all the steps that I went through to make this head. And the starting point that I always love to start with is a miniature sculpt. So this is the sculpt that I made for Hogger's head. I roughly patterned it to be quarter scale with the help of my quarter scale bust that you can purchase in a link in the description below for my Etsy shop. But I knew it didn't need to fit on the head, so I just patterned it, sculpted it so it would be the approximate size that I think I would need Hogger's head at. So you can see I kind of have the Hogger's face split into two for this. I have one side that I sculpted to be like what I wanted the finished form to look like, and the other side looks a little weird and different. So I originally sculpted both halves to look like this finished side, but I knew that in the construction I didn't want, when I pulled my pattern from this, I didn't want to pattern things like the lips, like this part of the muzzle I did not want to pattern. And also the lips around the edge I didn't want to pattern either. I knew it needed to be hinged, so on the second side I started just removing extraneous details that I knew I could add in later. Remove the snarl lines, a lot of the detail in the eyebrow region and everything. And I just simplified it down. I removed the lips and just had it to where the teeth would be. And I developed that this would be the hinge area. So I left the top and the bottom jaw in two pieces so that it would be, so that I could hinge it, and also so that I could pattern the palettes. Another strategy in simplifying the sculpt like this, it would simplify the pattern that I needed to sculpt, or needed to take, because when I take the pattern off this, it's already at quarter scale, so it's going to be a bunch of small pieces. I wanted to make them as big of small pieces as I could. So after sculpting the face in the way that I would want, what I did is I took the half that had the simplified shapes and I put masking tape over them very carefully, and very carefully with small pens marked all the little pieces. And when I removed those tape pieces, I put them onto 3x5 cards. I marked the pieces, and you see I have like my own special color pattern that I use to remind me of where the parts that needed to be beveled so they would poke out, and the parts that needed to be beveled so they'd poke in. I also did the registration marks and where I needed to flip the pattern. So this patterning process is definitely something that I'm going to go into more detail on another piece, but it's essentially just taking a very tiny tape pattern. Then after I got this, I was able to scan it into my computer and blow it up by 400%. Since it was at a quarter scale when I sculpted it, I just need to blow it up by 400% to make it to the full scale. These are 3x5 cards, so it allowed me to easily measure and scale it up that way from just a scan of these. The next step was selecting the foam that I would reconstruct the pattern that I got into the full scale with. My go-to was L200 because it is a very low density closed cell foam that is extremely lightweight. Like I've already discussed the need for how I needed to make this as lightweight as possible in another video, in my neck video, which you can get to right now. So L200. And I decided to go with a thinner version than I have before on other builds. So this is about 1/4 of an inch thick. I wondered if it would be strong enough to hold the shape because it's so thin and flexible. I figured that I could reinforce it if it wasn't strong enough, but that I would try to go as light as possible. And it actually worked pretty well. And you can see in the video now kind of what it looked like at its early stages. I just had little templates for the teeth made out of paper that I had pinned in place and was just kind of getting a feel for what it was. Those eyes were made out of ping pong balls that I just scribbled a pupil on, because the ping pong ball is approximately the same size as what his finished eyes are made out of. So here you can see the inside structure of Hogger's head. It is completely hollow through the entire thing. And the thing that gives it structure is all the different shapes that I made, as well as just a little bit of reinforcing around the jaw. And around the hinge, I actually did a double layer of the 1/4 inch foam, so it's 1/2 inch on each side of the hinge. The hinge was an interesting thing to figure out. I took an idea from another YouTuber who goes by Lost Wax, and they have a great tutorial on how they hinged a knight's helmet. And basically what it is you take a bit of polytubing and with your heat gun flare the edges so it holds tight to the foam. Because the L200 is very lightweight and I knew that there wouldn't be much weight on them, these hinges, I figured these hinges would be sufficient to hold the jaw on. In addition, the fur and the lips that I would add later on would also help hold the jaw to the top of the head. I also needed to make handholds for Hogger's head. What I ended up doing is just cutting layers of L200 to make a slot that my forefingers fit in, and then another slot that my thumb fit in for the bottom. Now you'll see all sorts of random bits inside Hogger's head. There's actually some upholstery foam that I used on the outside to help sculpt the lips. Also this structure at the very top of his head. This was to help support the chest spike that would hold the head up. There's also other miscellaneous straps and things to attach it to the neck. You'll also notice the mesh that I put in there. I had originally just blacked it out with black spandex. I ended up replacing it with the mesh for a little bit of extra vision. I could, in fact, hold this and see through his mouth just a little bit, like a little periscope. Helped certainly in some situations. You may have also noticed a slight bit of ripping around the left hinge. And I noticed that too. That's a problem. In the future, I will more heavily reinforce the hinge area. Also, the top of the head, which was meant to support the head from the chest spike, I noticed a little bit of stretching and pressure there. I would, in the future, also reinforce that area. But other than those two minor things, the 1/4 inch foam worked well enough and held its shape well enough. I just wish I would have reinforced those areas just a little bit more. Moving on to Hogger's teeth. His teeth are actually the exact same foam that I used to build his head with. So instead of a 1/4 inch black, I went with a 1/2 inch white. Now for his big canines, I glued 2 layers of this together and then carved the teeth down. All the rest of the teeth were individually carved out of this foam. I used a Dremel and Persona blades to help me get this shape as smooth as possible before going back in with the Dremel and also a wood engraver to get all those gnarly details. I found for the smaller teeth, like the front bottom and front top ones, it was easier to cut them out of a solid block of foam instead of each individual tooth. Then to glue the teeth in, I simply cut a void, almost like a socket, in my original skeletal form and used barge cement to glue them straight in. Now there were some drawbacks to doing the teeth this way. For one, since they're such a low density foam, they are very prone to damage. So you can see on the inside of his teeth where there's any wear or rub, there gets to be dents and wrinkles. Also, you can see on all the tips of his big teeth, the sealant and paint has already started to wear away. These are things that can be easily repaired and painted over again, but it's still a minor annoyance. If they were a more dense, harder foam, those damages would be harder to get, but it would also make the head heavier. So I had to compromise on the amount of detail and also the damage that I knew that they would get to keep this head as light as possible. The next step that I did was to work on his gums and his lips. Now, they were a very fun part that I had a fun time experimenting. This was the first time I did this. I took a product called Creature Cast Rubber, which it's a synthetic latex, so it's a neoprene material. It comes in many different hardnesses and 2 different colors, in black and in their white. So with the Superflex white, I took cotton balls and ripped them up, dipped them into some neoprene, some Creature Cast that I had put a tiny bit of acrylic paint in it to color it pink, and then I just began wrapping those cotton balls around the lips. It was a very satisfying process, and it gave me a lot of really gnarly texture for free. I started out with the gums first because I needed to build up a little more structure for the lips, but the lips and the gums are done the same way. The next step that I needed to take was start building up the forms that I didn't have on the under skull, is what I was calling it. So I needed to build up the lips and this part of the muzzle. I also needed to build up a structure on which I could fabricate the lips. I also added a little bit of padding on the back of his jaw, like the back of his chin right here, and also a little bit on the top of the head. Now, starting with a pattern from scratch and a miniature sculpt that, like I did, there's bound to be some adjustments you want to make, but it's still a good way to start because it gives you like this wonderful starting point that saves you so much time. So it's just minor adjustment that can be easily solved with a little more foam. The understructure of his lips was a little challenging to get because I wanted him to have this particular smile. So it was very important to the expression to get this part right. I spent many hours pinning little bits of 1/8 inch thick foam that I had rolled over onto itself to create the lips. And I did test after test, like opening and shutting the mouth, making sure it had the right expression. Because you see, he's smiling when he's got his mouth shut, and, you know, it still works and moves and looks good when he's opening his mouth. So getting the exact shape for the lips down was a challenge, but it was so important, and I didn't mind spending a couple hours trying to get it right. But once I did get it right, I was ready to apply the creature cast onto the lips, just like I did with the gums. This time using a black paint mixed in with the Superflex white instead of pink or red. You can see on the front part of the lips, I made sure to align the cotton balls in a very strict pattern, vertical pattern, to kind of simulate the texture that I observed in my own dog's lips. Also, there's these structures called flues, little round knob things on dog lips that just, I balled up a little bit of cotton ball and the neoprene on the back just to simulate those flues. All in all, I love how the lips turned out. They remained flexible enough to open and shut the mouth easily, but they also added a ton of free texture as well, which I wanted him to look really gross and detailed, and it would have taken me many, many hours. I'm not even sure I could have sculpted this by hand if I wanted to sculpt and mold it. So actually directly fabricating it saved me time and gave me all this free texture, which is awesome. Moving on to his eyes, I knew that his eyes would also be an extremely important part to the expression that Hogger had, so I needed to get them right. I knew I needed him to have like a tiny little focus pupil, and that would add to his crazed look. So what I actually ended up doing was a little bit of an evolution of my other eyes that I developed for my Greymane project. You can click now right here to see a tutorial for how I did that. So if you remember from that tutorial, the principle behind my other eyes was to have a sculpted iris inside a clear plastic globe ornament that you could open up and fill. And it creates this really kind of realistic depth eye. But for Hogger, I didn't need like a big, huge monster iris. I kind of wanted him to have a little bit of a human proportioned eye. So I ended up taking one of these and smashing a whole bunch of clay into it to get a round form that could roughly fit inside. Then I made sure to sculpt a little bit of a concave area in which I would paint the iris, and I also poked a hole inside for the depth of the pupil that I wanted. After I got the form sculpted, I made a mold so I could make multiple copies, and also I made the mold so I could rotocast the eyes. Now, rotocasting is a process where you swirl the resin around inside the mold, and so that it only cures and cures on the outside, creating a hollow form. I did this so that I could have like a complete eyeball, but have it be hollow to save on weight again. It was really fun to paint this eye up. I was able to paint the sclera the exact color that I wanted, as well as add some veins. To paint the iris, I used the smallest paintbrush I had and just started layering in different iris lines. I actually layered in some UV reactive fluorescent green paint to just add just a tiny bit of pop. In the low lights and numerous black lights at BlizzCon, his eyes really caught people's attention. When I installed the eyes, I used Warbler in the back to hold them in place, and also sculpted some eyelids out of Warbler. I just painted them black. Now onto the nose. I really like this nose. It was fun to make. I started out with clay. I used clay and sculpted approximately the size that I wanted, maybe slightly bigger, because I was planning on casting it out of yet more creature cast rubber. So when I was sculpting it, I did most of it while I was on the train, commuting to my then full-time job. Each trip was about an hour long, and I just kept adding more detail every time. And then I'd sit and look at it all day while I was at work or at night when I got home and think to myself, there's not enough detail there, I need to go farther. I would also think, it's too pretty and symmetrical, I need to add some damage. So slowly over a couple of days of sculpting, an hour at a time, I got to this point. I had quite a few scars of damage on it and quite a lot of texture. For these little bumps, I rolled up little balls and smashed them into the surface before using my tools to integrate them a little more. Once they were integrated enough, I took a texture stamp from a texture that I took off of my office chair and stamped more texture into the surface. The mold that I made for this was a plaster mold. The plaster mold was very important for how you cast latex or neoprene-like materials. There's no mixing or curing, it's basically drying out. The moisture being drawn out is what makes it cure. So you fill up your mold completely with the neoprene or latex, and the plaster helps draw out the moisture along your sculpted edges. After about 6 hours, you dump out the excess material back into a jar and then let what has dried and cured on the edges dry more completely. So you can see here is a nose. It's a miscast because it had a hole in the nostril that didn't cure correctly. But it is completely hollow and extremely lightweight. But it's also like pretty durable. It's strong enough to hold up to some abuse, which fronts of noses are banging against stuff all the time. Also, being made out of the neoprene, it readily accepts acrylic paint, so it's very easy to paint. In some of his scar lines across the nose, I added a pop of color with some red, like it was a more fresh scratch or split. Then I just used crystal clear to make it shiny and wet looking. Next up, I made a tongue, which the tongue is one of my favorite parts of the body to be like, oh, you gotta touch Hogger's tongue. It feels so cool. It has a lot of texture on it, little structures that look like they could be taste buds. And this was actually really easy to do. Using just regular minky fabric, the kind of soft fabric you would find on plushes or baby blankets, I just took some of the same neoprene that I had mixed up for the gums with the slight bit of red paint mixed in, and I slathered it across the surface of some of this minky after I'd sewed it into a tongue shape. When I slathered on the neoprene while it was still wet, I took my tool and teased the surface to create all the different structures. If you look at your own tongue, you'll notice that there's a lot more texture towards the back and the front is more smooth. So on Hogger's tongue, I made the front a little more smooth and the back really rough with texture. But it created this really awesome, unique look and a reason to get people to stick their hands in Hogger's mouth. Next up was applying the fur. Now, when I fur the faces, I found from Greymane that it was really nice to have this material from NFT, National Fiber Technology. They are the only company in the world that produces a fur with a stretch backing. So to have a fur with a stretch backing on the face is really valuable because you can just put it in place, glue it down, stretch it, glue it, stretch it, glue it, and slowly work your way over the face. So from their discount outlet store called Hairy Man's Closet, I'll leave a link in the description below. It's kind of tricky how to spell it. So I ordered this material. It's grayish brown, a lot more gray than brown. I wasn't too concerned with the color as long as it was close, and this ended up being a little too long, but check out this backing. Check out this stretch. It's such a cool material, and so I was able to take this and stretch and glue it down onto Hogger's face. Then in the areas where it was easy, like just the back of the head and the chin and stuff on the ears, I just used the regular fur that I'd been using for the rest of his body. I knew it looked funny before airbrushing, but I knew I would be airbrushing it, so I wasn't concerned with the color difference too much. I just liked that it was this super coarse fur that had a really cool texture to it, and it had that stretch backing to make furring the face really easy. It was also really important to have this stretchy fur on the corners of Hogger's mouth. Now, since he needed to have a lot of movement there, having this stretch fur there so that there wouldn't be any bunching or tightness there, just have it like flex really easy and naturally, was really important on this head. Then for the ears, I used a material called Faux-Shape. Now, it starts out as a fabric like this. It looks and feels very much like felt, but it's a thermoplastic fabric. So when you apply heat to it, it'll kind of seize up and stay and hold its shape. But still, like, it depends on how much you heat it up, it can still remain quite flexible. So Hogger's ears, he still has a little bit of flex. I added this curve in them so that it would have a natural shape, but they still have a lot of flex in them. For the inside texture of the ears, I took some fleece that I had in a tan color, and I just slowly began gluing it down in small sections, pinching as I went to create these inner ear folds to add just a little bit of detail to this area. After the inner ear was done, of course, added the fur on the back of the ear. I also had to shave the face. The problem is this NFT fur wasn't agreeing with my clippers, so I actually had to hand trim the fur with scissors. It's a little rough and choppy if you look close, but I thought that it added to the look of Hogger since he needed to be dirty and unkempt. It really just added to his texture and personality. To attach the ears to the head, I actually just sewed it to the fur that was on the top of his head. Instead of gluing them down and anchoring them on the underform itself, this allowed for a lot of extra floppy motion. Like when you shake his head, his ears go wobbling. That's because they're only attached to the fur. If you reach your hand up in here, like I'm pushing his head away, and you can see it's just sewn in right there. And then the last stage is airbrushing. Airbrushing is the stage where everything just pops. Everything it comes together. I don't know, it's great. So his face, he's a hyena. Hyenas have dark faces, so I went with a dark muzzle look that I was able to gradate and kind of blend into this other color fur that was completely different from this gray that I had his face at. Airbrushing is just a matter of starting with light colors and going over areas and then building that up to the darkest areas that you want. I know I'm not the best painter in the world, but airbrushing is just a matter of getting this blended properly, mixing the colors the right way, really just starting with your thinnest colors, going thicker and thicker, building up thin layer on thin layer until you get it just right. On Hogger, I was actually more brave than I've ever been and went a little more heavy-handed with a lot of my airbrushing than I normally do. And I'm really grateful that I pushed myself to do that because I thought the contrast ended up being really great. And so there you have it. That's a breakdown of how I built Hogger's head. I hope you learned something valuable from it. If you want to learn more about techniques I use to finish heads in particular, I recently did a tutorial for cosplaysupplies.com and using Veriform to build a head. But in addition to showing how you can build a base with Veriform, I went on to explain how you can finish a form. I went into more detail about how I did these gums and how to pattern and lay the fur. Also, how to paint and airbrush, a little more detail on the ears and finishing edges. So if you're interested in that, there's a link in the description below. And I thank you so much for watching. Remember to hit the subscribe button so you'll know when I'll come back with even more tutorials and creature building tips. I'm Kazul, reminding you to embrace your inner beast.